Unexpected Date Night by James Light. This reading was commissioned by Corey19. Bonus Chapter, Date Night. Rainbow Dash and Soarin touched down on the large puffy cloud, carrying the mare's extravagant homestead, ready to rest after a day full of fun. Well, it was more crash than land, as the two finished their race through Ponyville by flying headfirst into the white cotton candy-like substance that floated high above the town. And while the day had certainly been enjoyable for both of them, it was a certain kind of fun that had the two lovebirds exhausted. Rainbow wearily picked herself up, certain of her victory by the narrowest of margins over her wonderful colt friend. Ha! Ooh. Wiping a mix of sweat and cloud-based condensation from her forehead with the back of her hoof, she turned towards the stallion next to her and smiled. "Told ya, you can't beat the fastest mare in Equestria." Soarin cracked his neck, picking himself on wobbly hooves that most certainly granted him the narrowest of victories over his rather fast mare friend. You kidding me? He took a moment to take a series of deep breaths, calming down the heavy beat of his heart. I totally just did. Rainbow chuckled, weakly lifting her hoof and pushing Soarin on the shoulder. After the day she had, her shove was more like a light poke in the stallion's side, moving her more than it did him. Psh, yeah, right. She walked forward towards the edge of the cloud and sat with a loud grunt, glancing back at Soarin and waving him over to join her. You're lucky I'm too pooped to argue. Get over here, you big lug. Soarin settled down next to her, a grunt much like Rainbow's escaping his chest as he flopped down onto his hind limb. Well, after all the, things we did today, he chuckled when Rainbow gave him another poke shove, turning his head towards her and smiling. Rainbow gave him a sly grin in return, one that faded away into awe as she caught the glowing orb of the moon hanging high above them in Soarin's eyes. She turned away, hoping the stallion hadn't caught the blush growing on her cheeks in the dark of the night. Wouldn't want to be too mushy. Yeah. Soarin frowned. Something wrong? He extended a wing towards her, wrapping her up in its warmth and lovingly rubbing her back with its soft feathers. Did you not enjoy it? Rainbow giggled and leaned towards him, resting her body against his to better absorb his heat in the crisp night air. Oh, Celestia, did I ever? She turned towards him and smirked, leaning in to heatily whisper into his ears. And from what I saw, somebody else certainly enjoyed it too. Soarin blushed, rubbing the back of his head as Rainbow kissed his cheek and pulled away. Yeah, we were certainly, active today. They shared a laugh, turning towards the dark expanse of Ponyville beneath their floating cloud of solitude. I'll go so far as to say that today was perfect, straight from the moment I woke up. Soarin groaned as his eyes slowly fluttered open. The haze of a new morning in Equestria heavily settled into his mind, but slowly burning away in the light of the rising sun. Images of a recent dream not yet faded away flashed before his mind's eye. Two blue pegasi dancing amongst the clouds as they flew over the bustling audience at a Wonderbolt show. The dream had come to an abrupt end as he was making a high-speed turn right up against the raucous crowd, and, strangely enough, some kind of warm, wet sensation enveloped his body from the waist down. When he had looked down in his dream, he was greeted with the smiling face of his new mare friend between his legs. He also saw the above-average stallion hood pressed up against her face as she slobbered all over it, the larger-than-normal rods sticking right through a hole in his flight suit. Of course, as soon as he turned his attention back to where he was flying, he crashed into a large, rainbow-shaped cloud and woke up with a startled jolt. He brought a hoof up and over his forehead as a beam of light from the nearby window struck him head-on, searing his unadjusted eyes with the brilliance of Celestia's sun. The pain did little to distract from the ache emanating from the rest of his body. His muscles sore from the day before, and as he thought about everything that had transpired the night before and smiled to himself, a night of rather intense physical exertion. His body began to gradually wake in a wave down his body, the familiar cushion of Rainbow's couch pressing against his back, feeling so good he almost felt like just falling back asleep. The only thing preventing another dream round of flying with Rainbow was the strange warmth still surrounding him below the waist, a sensation apparently carried over from the land of fantasies into the real world. He gave out a weak croak, swallowing some of the near dried out spit sitting in his mouth to help lubricate his throat before trying to speak again. What? Picking his head up and glancing down his body, he nearly jumped up in surprise when he saw that some kind of large blue blob was covering the lower half of his body. The strange mass was moving ever so slightly between his legs, and each time it shifted even the slightest, a sharp pang of pleasure raced up his spine to help jolt his still half-slumbering mind awake. Rubbing his eyes in the hopes of reducing the blur that clouded his vision, he gave out a weak groan as another surge of sensation blasted into his body. Opening his eyes revealed the culprit, the rainbow-colored mane of the similarly named mare coming into view as his sight began to clear. As Soarin opened his mouth to once again try and get her attention, yet another wave of bliss coursed through his veins and transformed his words into a deep moan. Rainbow smirked, dragging her tongue once more up the curve of Soarin's balls and chuckling as the meaty shaft resting against the tip of her muzzle throbbed in response. Her eyes were trained on his face, as they had been for the past several minutes of watching the stallion sleep. Her intention had been to just observe the sexy stallion smile while in his sleep, but Rainbow wasn't the kind of mare to sit still for too long. And seeing as just nudging the stallion awake would have been rather boring to a mare who loved excitement, she decided on a slightly different tactic to rouse her colt friend from his slumber. And as any pony else in her position would surely do, the best idea she could come up with at the time was to start licking his junk. Another drag of the tongue against his hefty orbs got quite the pleasant shiver from the stallion, the bundled up sheet before her twitching as the lank hidden within began to stir. She gave him a sly grin as she watched her every move, planting a wet kiss on each of his balls before pulling away. "Good morning, sleepyhead." Soarin brought up a hoof to rub at his forehead, turning towards the window to see the blazing sun hanging high in the sky. What time is it?" Rainbow giggled, glancing at the clock on the wall for a moment before turning her attention back to the defenseless stallion on her couch. It's a little before noon. Figured that would be plenty of rest for you." He chuckled, making the move to sit up until a hoof pressed into his chest and held him down. His well-thought-out joke about the situation was interrupted by another lick across his sensitive sack. The two fragile orbs held inside treated with, surprisingly, the utmost care from the normally rambunctious Pegasus. Rainbow moved again, this time slowly dragging the hoof on his chest down his body towards his crotch. He groaned as she made a teasing detour around his junk, the sleeping length still buried inside of his sheet, awakening as it readied itself for another round of playtime. Soarin gasped as Rainbow nudged his thighs apart, giving her better access to the sweet treats hanging out of his slightly open flight suit. "Don't you think we should have something to eat first?" Rainbow chuckled, an evil glint to her eyes that scared the stallion as much as it turned him on. She lowered her head, mouth hovering over the bundled up flesh of his sheet. "Oh, I have a different kind of meal in mind." Her mouth opened up wide as she closed the distance between her and the warm bulge, sitting unprotected between Soarin's legs. She moaned as her lips pressed against the flesh of his sheath, flicking out her tongue and dragging it across the head of his still-concealed cock as she surrounded its home in warmth. Her taste buds were assaulted by his overwhelming flavor of pure masculinity, as she could feel her marehood winking madly, like a mare in heat, as her lips pressed into the base of his crotch. A pair of licks against the sensitive tip got it to come out and play, and as Soarin's cock began to expand from its warm home, it went straight into the even warmer cavern of Rainbow's maw. Rainbow was eventually forced to pull away from Soarin's lap, moaning around the thick log that continued to grow past her lips, all the way to press against the back of her throat. She kept her eyes on her new cult friend, swallowing round his impressive length as he brought a hoof up to his balls and massaged the orbs inside of their leathery sack. She smiled when Soarin groaned and brought a hoof behind her head, or at least as much of a smile as she could make out, with an above-average stallionhood wedged between her lips. Soarin sighed in bliss, leaning back against the couch and adjusting herself into a more comfortable position. Leaning his head back and closing his eyes, he chuckled to himself as he began to slowly push Rainbow's head back and forth between his legs. One hell of a wake-up, Rainbow. Both shared a laugh at the edge of the cloud, Rainbow pressing herself as close as possible to Soarin as they reminisced about their day. Ha! Yeah, that was certainly the right way to wake you up, huh? He nudged her, chuckling as he squeezed her side with his wing. Pfft, heck yeah, I'll take that any day over the crap alarm clocks we usually use when we're out touring. Rainbow's mouth slowly fell to a frown. Yeah, touring. Soarin turned his head at the sudden sadness in her voice, frowning himself when he saw the mare deep in thought. It didn't take much to figure out what had caused the sudden mood change. Hey, he gave her another squeeze, this one softer as more of a loving gesture rather than a playful one. Don't you go worrying about that stuff. We'll figure it out. He smiled when she glanced at him out of the corner of her eyes, leaning in to plant a quick kiss on her cheek before rubbing it in with his own. We get plenty of off time, especially between tours. Plus, Cloudsdale isn't too far from here, so on training days I can always come visit. His smile grew as her frown dissipated. He gave her one last squeeze before he pulled away, leaning back on his hooves as he stared up at the stars in the sky. And hey, dating a Wonderbolt means you can get free tickets to all the shows you want. How's that for a bonus? Rainbow finally cracked, chuckling as a smile crossed her lips. Yeah, that's up there. Not sure it beats what you're packed between your legs, though. Soarin blushed, absent-mindedly crossing his legs, as he caught Rainbow catching an eyeful of the dark blue flesh sitting between his thighs. Yeah. An image from earlier in the day came to mind. His blush faded away as a smirk grew on his lips. You certainly do seem attached to my junk, he chuckled, reopening his legs to let her drink it all in. I mean, what the hey happened when we were about to leave, huh? It was Rainbow's turn to blush, tearing her gaze away from Soarin's crotch, and embarrassedly rubbing the back of her head. Well... Rainbow closed the front door, shifting through the bundle of letters she got in the mail as Soarin lounged on the couch. She had been somewhat embarrassed when Derpy mentioned something about the state of her mane, but luckily the mailmare hadn't pushed her any more once she said it was from some early morning flying. Of course, when the grey mare had then peeked inside and waved to Soarin, who was flat on his back with a flaccid cock glistening in the morning light hanging between his legs, any hope of keeping her activities a secret had been killed on the spot. Yet, Derpy had simply smiled and hoofed over her mail, turning around with a wave before, somewhat clumsily, she had launched off the side of the cloud to go and continue her route. Soarin sat up and rotated his neck a couple of times, making popping noises loud enough to sicken the average pony, but were music to Rainbow's ears. I've been laying here too long. He arched his back, moaning as a deafening crack came from the weary bones. Celestia above, you really did a number on me, Rainbow. Rainbow chuckled, passing by the couch and walking into her kitchen to sort through the mail. Come on, you wimp. I thought the Wonderbolts were made of tougher stuff. He rolled off the couch and landed on wobbly hooves, taking a moment to catch his hoofing before stretching his entire body out. We're trained to be sunflowers, Dash, not to be ridden like a bull at an Appaloosa rodeo. Soarin's stomach suddenly let its presence known, rumbling like a thunderstorm as it demanded to be fed. He quickly glanced over at the door to the kitchen, sighing in relief as he saw Rainbow had not heard it. So, how about a bite to eat? Got anything here, or should we head out? Rainbow absentmindedly called back, still engrossed in the various bills, junk mail, and the occasional letter from a fan piled up on her kitchen table. Sure, we can go out. She smiled to herself as she came across a small hoof-written letter about her #1 fan, hoof made on a colorful piece of construction paper. I know a place where we can get some hay fries or something. Soarin flared out his wings, performing the day-to-day stretches that had been drilled into him from his time at the Wonderbolts Academy. Yeah, that sounds good. My treat. Celestia knows I have more bits than I can deal with. Ha! Finished with her mail, Rainbow got up and, after getting a quick glass of water from the fridge, made her way back towards the living room. A cult friend who can get me Wonderbolts tickets, has a nice dick, and plenty of money? I must be the luckiest mare alive. Soarin chuckled as he finished up his wing stretches and moved on to his hooves. He slowly took off his flight suit, wincing as he removed the tight garment. Yeah, I know. I am pretty awesome. Letting it fall to the ground, he sighed as the cool morning air blew across the now unguarded fur covering his body, leaning back as he extended his forehooves as far as they could go in front of him. He groaned as the muscles, stiff from being stuck in the same position for so long, came back to life. Should we head out soon? Rainbow glanced over at him. Yeah, you... She immediately stopped in her tracks. Soarin, who for the first time that day was now fully in the nude, was stretching out his legs with a normal pose most Pegasi learned at a young age. Problem was, with Soarin facing away from her as he did it, his bare bottom was now presented to Rainbow on a silver platter. The dangling weights of his balls slowly swayed between the stallion's legs, framed by the dark blue sheet that hung just beyond them. And when Soarin moaned as he arched his back, mane flipping up and over his head like the mares in Rarity special swimsuit fashion magazines that the fashionista liked to gab on and on about, would do for their photoshoot pose, Rainbow felt her tail flag and her marehood wink as warmth flooded into her loins. Yeah, what, Rainbow? Are you... He turned, just in time to see the hungry mare out of the corner of his eyes, as she spread her wings and launched herself off the ground, right towards him. Rainbow, Like a mare shot out of a cannon, Rainbow slammed into his chest, knocking the air out of his lungs and toppling him head over hooves. The two Pegasi rolled as one until impacting the far wall, Soarin's back slamming against the soft cloud with Rainbow in his laps. Rainbow, what are you... A sudden blast of feathers in his face silenced him, or at least until he moaned, as Rainbow's other wing reached down and wrapped itself around his balls. Wincing from both the impact and the sudden surge of pleasure racing up his spine, Soarin attempted to get up to separate himself from the insatiable mare on top of him. A quick hoof to the chest was enough to stop him, and soon the constant fondling of his balls caused his stallionhood to give in to the mare's demands as it started to slip from its sheath. Rainbow smirked at the fox terror on her colt friend's face. Oh, we're not going anywhere yet, stud. With that, Rainbow moved her wing from his balls to the base of his member, and with now practiced ease, slipped his hardening shaft into her marehood. Rainbow sheepishly rubbed the back of her head. Well, I just couldn't contain myself. Ah! Soarin smirked at her, leaning in to give her a peck on the cheek before giving her a friendly shake with the wing wrapped around her shoulders. Yeah, I know I'm hot as the TARTARUS, but damn! He brought a hoof down between his legs and mockingly winced as he tapped the side of his thigh. You have to be so rough. I'm going to be sore for weeks. Laughing, Rainbow landed another shot right into his shoulder. This one harder than her last few, as she slowly regained her strength. You better be careful, mister. At this rate, you're going to be bruised all over by the time you get back to your team. Yeah, he shrugged. Who knew my mare friend was going to be so rough with frail old me? Chuckling, he turned towards her and suggestively waggled his eyebrows. Especially when we're out in public. Dang, this movie sucks. Soarin chuckled, reaching into his box of hay fries to pop another one into his mouth. Shh, it's getting to the best part. Rainbow rolled her eyes. You know, for an elite athlete, you certainly seem to like your junk food. I mean, we just had hay fries for lunch, and here you are having another box half an hour later. Soarin glanced out of the corner of his eyes and gave her a small grin, the whiteness of his eyes and his sparkling teeth glowing in the dark of the room. He lifted a hoof up to his lips and shushed her, turning his attention back to the action on screen without a single word. Rainbow turned away, pouting her lips and crossing her forelegs across her chest. So that's how it's gonna be, huh? She glanced to her left, noticing that with their position in the far back of the movie theater, no pony was sitting in the same row as them. In fact, as she checked the rest of her surroundings, the few ponies in the room with them were not in their immediate vicinity. That, plus the darkness permeating the room, meant she could do just about anything without getting caught. She smirked, a devilish idea forming in her head. Soarin tore his attention away from the high-intensity fight scene going on in the movie as his mare friend stood up and began walking in front of him. Her wings suddenly shut out, knocking the hay fries right out of his hooves before he could even react. He watched the golden stalks fall towards the ground in slow motion, unable to save the treasure that was his favorite food before they hit the theater floor with, at least to his ears, a loud boom. Soarin hissed through his teeth, loud enough to voice his displeasure, but quiet enough to not be heard by outsiders. Rainbow, what the hey? I was eating. Oh my, I'm so sorry, Soarin. Rainbow made a grand, sweeping gesture toward the floor with her wings, glancing around at the other ponies in the theater, as if hoping they heard her. I didn't mean to knock your hay fries to the floor. Let me just help my co-friend pick them back up. As Rainbow began to go down, Soarin's eyes perked up. Rainbow, what in Equestria are you... Soarin's expression changed from one of questioning to one of quintessential, "Are you kidding me?" look, as Rainbow leaned in and rubbed her cheeks against his junk. What the heck are you doing? Rainbow rubbed the side of her face against his balls, groaning to herself as she felt the warm weights press against her cheeks. She glanced up at him, lips curved up into a devilish smile, as she laid her head against his sheet. Just enjoying myself. Soarin rolled his eyes. Really? You had to sacrifice some perfectly good sticks of golden joy just for this? She continued rubbing against his crotch, purring like a cat as she did so. Just keep watching your movie, babe. I see something a little more interesting down here. Soarin pouted, crossing his arms across his chest as he turned his attention back to the screen. You know what? Fine. But just to punish you for wasting some good hay fries, I'm not even going to get a... Rainbow pulled back, letting the now spit-soaked balls in her mouth flop back onto the theater seat. What was that, dear? She smirked, leaning back in towards the treasure trove tucked between his legs. You were saying something? Stealing his nerves and keeping his focus on the movie as it began to reach its climatic crescendo, Soarin grit his teeth and tried to keep his quickly engorging shaft from being drawn out by his mare friend's tempting ministration. Of course, Rainbow was not one to be outdone, so the mare stepped up to her efforts in Operation Soarin Boner by dragging her tongue across the still sheath tip of his cock. Soarin winced as his stallionhood started to extend from its home, cursing his own dick as it betrayed him. Come on, little Soarin, just one lick and you turn your back on me? We've been bros forever, dude. Rainbow popped the head of his length between her lips, looking up at his face, even as his stallionhood unsheathed right into the warm, wet trap of her mouth. Yeah, right, brah. I've got a date with some hot tongue action. See ya! Soarin could feel sweat start to form on his brow, his mind taxed as much as his body, as he tried to deny his hay-fry-wasting mare friend the pleasures of his stallionhood. It was an epic war, one that would be retold for many years to come as one of the finest examples of body control by mortal ponies. Or, at least, that's what Soarin wished happened, as within a mere matter of seconds his slank had reached full mast and dangled over the theater floor. Rainbow, come on, I'm trying to... Rainbow silenced him with a wet smooch to the tip of his stallion hood. Chuckled as the entire slab of stallion meat quivered and dropped a thick line of prey towards the floor. She backed away from his crotch and leaned against the back of the next row of seats, smiling at the pout on his face as she made herself comfortable between his legs. Shh, just let Mare have her fun. As one of her hoofs made its way between her own legs, a wing shot out from her side and, with impeccable accuracy, darted forward and wrapped around his turgid member. Soarin clenched his eyes and grit his teeth as the soft feathers wrapped around the midsection of his stallion hood, biting down on one of his hooves to muffle a moan as Rainbow began to jack him off with a wing. "Ugh, crap!" Chuckling, Rainbow laid the heavy tip of Soarin's cock against her tongue as she continued rubbing it with her wing. "Come on, give it to me, baby." As some upbeat music began to play, signaling the end of the movie as the hero stood triumphant over his villainous foe, Soarin leaned back against his chair and spread his legs to give her more room to work with. He had to practically swallow his entire hoof to silence the heated moaning of her name as a second wing joined the first around his cock, both trim appendages jacking him off better than any hoof he had ever experienced. In fact, it was so good that within only a few minutes he began to feel a now familiar tingling start to build in his balls, and with that he picked his head up and glanced between his legs. Rainbow, I'm close." Rainbow smirked, her tongue slowly lapping up the copious amount of prey leaking from the head of his shaft. "That's it. Give it to me." She opened her lips and used them to seal the widening flare within her mouth, grinding her tongue against its flat surface as her wings squeezed the base. She kept her eyes on his, a half-lidded, heated stare that bored through into his soul, and demanded that he unleash his load. He tried to keep his eyes on her for as long as he could, but as all the muscles in his body tensed up, and the flare trapped within the warm confines of Rainbow's mouth throbbed, he let his head roll back as the first salvo of his seed raced up his shaft and exploded into his mare friend's maw. Rainbow moaned round his cock as the sudden blast of warmth coated her tongue in Soarin's essence, quickly swallowing the offered gift before the next could arrive, lest her mouth overflow and she spill it. As one wing held the base of his quivering member, the other moved down to cup his balls, gently rubbing the orbs with her fluffy feathers to help empty them of their creamy contents. And as her cheeks began to bulge out from Soarin's intense orgasm, it certainly seemed that they had plenty to offer her. Soarin was subject to intense, full-body clenches that racked his body with orgasmic spasm, his mare friend masterfully milking him of his seed. Each time it felt like his cock had throbbed its last, she would give the base of it a couple pumps to reignite his climax. Each time it felt like his balls had been fully drained of their full-bearing essence, the gentle touch of her feathers would inspire them to create more. And each time he felt himself fall into the dark abyss of a climax-induced coma, Rainbow pulled him right back in with another lashing strike of her tongue across the spewing tip of his cock. "Fuck." Rainbow slowly, sensually suckled on the head of his cock, eyes closed, as she drank her fill of his stallion cream. The heavy globs of seed rushing into her mouth bloated out her cheeks and leaked between the seal of her lips, white drips of cum flowing down the blue fur covering her chin to drop onto the theater floor below. Some even splattered onto her wings, streaking the soft blue feathers with sticky strands of cum as they continued to work his cock and balls to perfection. Her moans reached a fevered pitch as the hoof between her legs became a blur, flying back and forth across her puffy lips in a cacophony of wet squelches and heated gasp. Her other hoof joined the first, grinding against the pink pearl sitting atop her marehood that had begun to rapidly wink its pleasure to the world. Already a small puddle had formed beneath her, a lustful concoction of mare juice and stallion cream mixed together underneath the two lovers that continued to grow. And then, as a hoof suddenly reached down and cupped the side of her face, Rainbow looked up into the eyes of her beloved cult friend and felt her marehood clench in orgasm. Pulling away from Soarin and letting the full bloated head of his cock slip between her lips with a wet popping sound, Rainbow grit her teeth and groaned as spasms began to rack her body. Luckily, there wasn't any pony sitting in the next row over, else they would have been subject to Rainbow slamming herself into the back of their chair as she rode out a mind-shattering climax that caused her vision to blur and her mind to blank. She could barely even feel the last vestiges of Soarin's seed splattering over her face, the warmth lost in the euphoric wave of bliss that filled her body. Yet, even as her eyes rolled up to the back of her head and her body sat paralyzed on the theater floor by the numbing shocks of orgasm, her hoof continued to work her quivering lips as they leaked out copious amounts of their sweet nectar of lust, guiding her through her orgasm and helping her descend from the peaks of pleasure. Soarin watched his mare friend twitch her way through her climax as his own faded into the back of his mind. He adjusted himself in his seat, leaning back more to better appreciate the special kind of euphoria that could only come from another rainbow-induced climax. He peered over his body, amazed at how he had come out of the ordeal unscathed, past the glimmering spit coating the head of his cock had while Rainbow was a mess. But even then, as he gazed upon the streak of white in her mane and the rivulets of seed that ran down her chin, all he could see was his beautiful mare friend. He gently rubbed her cheek, a warmth blossoming in his chest as she opened her fiery eyes and locked gazes with him. He closed his eyes and sighed as she leaned in to plant one final kiss on his slowly deflating stallionhood, removing her wings from his crotch to lay the meaty shaft against his cushiony balls. Just as her lips pressed against his quivering length, a flashlight was suddenly aimed right at their faces. Soarin and Rainbow shared a laugh, the Wonderbolt turning towards his mare friend to lay another kiss on her cheek. Well, it was certainly a way to get thrown out of a theater. Rainbow giggled into a hoof. Hey, sometimes you just gotta live a little, you know? Smiling, Soarin squeezed her midsection with a wing. Yeah, feel bad for whoever had to clean that up. His grin widened, showing off the sparkling white teeth hidden behind his lips. And for that poor guy who found us, probably scarred him for life. Rainbow, laying her head on his shoulder and looking out at the moon, chuckled. Yeah, right. Two good-looking ponies like us? I'm sure he's often, you knows where, thinking about it right now. Their laughter rang in the crisp night air over Ponyville, slowly dying off into a comfortable silence as the two watched the bright orbs of the moon rising above them. Soarin turned his head towards Rainbow, pressing his muzzle into her mane and planting a kiss on the top of her head. He laid his head on top of hers, lovingly rubbing her side with a wing as they watched the night sky. And then we went on that flight. Soarin tilted his head, questioningly gazing up at the stars. Come to think of it, that was the only time we didn't wind up banging. Rainbow chuckled, nuzzling herself up against his side. Hey, if every day was full of banging and flying, I'll die a happy mare. Soarin happily sighed, returning the affectionate muzzle tenfold. The two paced sat in silence for several minutes, contentedly drifting over the slumbering town of Ponyville atop their cloud of solitude. The only sound was the soft breeze washing through their manes. The two ponies too high up to hear whatever bugs and critters roamed around during the night on the ground below. Soarin turned towards Rainbow. You know, Rainbow turns towards Soarin. What? Soarin's mouth curved up into a devilish smirk. You know I totally beat you, right? Rainbows returned his grin in kind. Oh yeah? She suddenly shoved Soarin away from her, the stallion toppling over onto his side from the force. She made her way towards the front door, swaying her hips back and forth as she walked. As she reached the entryway to her home, she turned to look over her shoulder at Soarin with a heated glare. Well, how about we go inside and I give the winner his reward? With that, she opened the door and disappeared inside, but not before whipping her tail to the side to expose her glistening lips to the stunned stallion still sitting at the edge of the cloud. Soarin watched her go, mouth splitting open into a grin as his stallion hood began to harden between his legs. With one last turn towards the moon hanging high overhead, he wearily picked himself up and made his way inside, ready to have another night of fun with the rambunctious, sometimes rough, sometimes hay fry wasting, but all the times loved mare friend.